Soft arrived at the Bitterroot Wildlife Refuge when he was just 5 days old. His tiny body barely the length of a man's hand, his breath thin and ragged, his cries no louder than a whisper of wind through the trees. He had been found beside his sister, Sweet, in the hollow of a tree trunk after a heavy storm swept through the Montana mountains. The tree had been partially uprooted, leaning like a splintered giant against the slope. When the rangers discovered them, they were cold, to the touch and soaked through, their fur matted with mud and debris. Their mother was nowhere to be found, likely a victim of the weather or something worse, predators, poachers, or nature's cruel timing. The two bobcat cubs were no bigger than squirrels, their eyes still unopened, their legs too weak to support even a crawl. They were rushed to the Bitterroot Wildlife Refuge by a team that had seen enough loss to know not to get their hopes up too soon. But hope clung to Soft and Sweet like a shadow. The refuge wasn't large or flashy. It wasn't funded by major organizations or teeming with volunteers. It was a modest facility nestled among pine-covered ridges, run by a skeleton crew of caretakers and wildlife rehabbers who believed in giving every animal, no matter how small or fragile, a fighting chance. They worked in shifts, sleeping on cots between feedings, blending special formula in dimly lit rooms while snow piled up outside. Sweet was strong from the start. She announced her presence with a sound far too powerful for her size. Sharp, high-pitched cries that echoed down the corridor. She latched onto the bottle like a champion, her tiny paws gripping it fiercely, tail twitching with determination. Her eyes opened within days, bright amber slits that took in everything. She learned to walk faster, climb faster, adapt faster. When the staff introduced enrichment toys, she was the first to attack them, clumsy paws swiping at dangling feathers or rolling balls with erratic joy. She played with a ferocity that made them laugh, a wild glint already flashing through her gaze. Soft was different. He didn't cry for food the way Sweet did. He didn't fight to be first in line or push her aside during mealtime. Instead, he waited. His movements were slower, more hesitant, as if he didn't quite trust the world to hold him yet. He curled himself into Sweet's side when they slept, his head buried beneath her chin. When he did take the bottle, it was with small, cautious sips. He wasn't weak, just gentler, more inward. He watched, absorbing his surroundings with eyes that seemed too thoughtful for a creature so young. The staff grew concerned. While Sweet rapidly gained weight, Soft hovered on the edge. There were days when he barely ate at all, and they wondered if he would make it. They checked his vitals constantly, ran tests, adjusted his feeding schedule, but nothing told them what he needed most. Until one day, while Sweet was in another room for a brief checkup, Soft let out the smallest, strangest cry, one that no one had heard from him before. It was a whimper of longing, a searching sound. When Sweet was returned to the crate, he crawled toward her with surprising strength, nuzzled into her neck and fell asleep immediately. That's when they realized he wasn't just a fragile cub. He was a bonded one. Soft didn't thrive unless Sweet was nearby. Her presence gave him courage. He mirrored her rhythms. If she played, he tried. If she explored, he followed. He didn't initiate, but he participated. She was the spark, and he was the ember that glowed in her light. Weeks passed, then months. They both grew, but in different ways. Sweet was independent, daring, and increasingly vocal about her needs. When the wildlife biologist from the Northern Sanctuary arrived asking about a female bobcat cub for their conservation program, the decision, though difficult, was obvious. Sweet would thrive in a structured natural enclosure where she could grow with minimal human contact and be prepared for life either in the wild or as part of a breeding program. She had the instincts, the edge, the fire. Soft didn't, not in the same way. The day Sweet left, the air in the refuge shifted. Even the staff felt it. The moment she was placed in the transport crate, Soft became still. He didn't approach the mesh like he usually did. He didn't whimper. He didn't try to follow. He simply sat, eyes wide and fixed on the space where she'd been moments before. When her crate was carried out and the vehicle door closed, he didn't move at all. He stayed that way for hours. One of the caretakers, an older man named Joel, tried coaxing him with his favorite toy, a stuffed mouse he liked to toss against the wall, but Soft didn't respond. He pushed food toward the front of the enclosure. Nothing. He tried to speak in that soothing tone Soft always responded to. Stillness. That night, when the cameras recorded Soft's behavior during the unattended hours, it was the same footage replayed in loop, the small bobcat sitting in the exact spot where Sweet had last lain. He didn't eat. He didn't move. He didn't cry. The next morning, he was coaxed to drink water, but only barely. He touched the toy once, then abandoned it. The staff knew this would be hard, but they hadn't realized just how deep that bond had run. Not just dependence, but love. True, undeniable love between two orphaned cubs who had only each other when the world took their mother away. Soft didn't lose weight after Sweet left. He didn't fall into illness or show signs of physical decline. But something inside him dimmed. He stopped seeking out his caretakers. He no longer reacted with curiosity to new things. When other animals were brought in for rehabilitation, owls, with broken wings, injured deer, even another young bobcat with a leg wound, Soft showed no interest. He kept his distance. He spent his days curled in the corner by the window, watching the snowfall drift down onto the frozen grass outside. From then on, he grew quieter. Months passed. He grew larger, his coat thickening, his paws heavy with muscle, but his demeanor still strangely tender. While other bobcats his age snarled and climbed and shredded enrichment toys, Soft preferred curling up by the window or quietly watching the birds flit outside the glass. Some of the volunteers whispered that he was different, maybe not wild enough, maybe too soft for the world he was born into. He would sit for hours in the sunspots that filtered through the south-facing windows, his amber eyes following the flutter of wings or the falling of snow. Other bobcats lunged at insects, leapt for high beams, tore up their bedding in a show of adolescent rebellion. Soft would simply curl his tail around his feet and blink slowly when someone passed by. A few handlers joked he'd become part house cat, but it wasn't laziness. It was something quieter, deeper, a way of being in the world that didn't rely on chaos to make sense. His enrichment tests always came back puzzling. He didn't care for chase toys, didn't get riled up by scents or hidden treats the way the others did. But when a staff member brought in an old radio and left it near his space, Soft began to gravitate toward it. The classical station came in clearest, and that's what played most mornings. The soft strings of violins, the mellow tones of piano, chords, they seemed to calm him. He'd sit pressed against the corner closest to the radio, ears flicking gently with the rhythm, eyes half closed, perfectly still. For him, noise wasn't stimulation. It was comfort. He remained healthy, eating and drinking and sleeping with regularity, but he didn't seek out the company of the other young animals, even when they did. Another bobcat was temporarily housed a few enclosures away. Soft showed little interest. It was as if he had poured all his social energy into Sweet, and once she was gone, he decided to live the rest of his life as an observer. There were concerns, of course. The team debated whether he could ever be released into the wild, not because he lacked the instincts, those could be taught, reinforced, but because he lacked the aggression, the drive. He didn't posture. He didn't fight. If food was placed near another animal, he deferred. If startled, he didn't lash out. He merely retreated. They experimented with slow, gentle interaction. A few handlers who had known him since his first days at the shelter would sit near his space and talk, read aloud, leave small objects for him to sniff. He responded, but only to certain voices, only to certain people. His trust, it seemed, had become selective, not out of fear, but discernment. He had learned to wait for the one who felt right. Meanwhile, in a quiet town 3 hours south of the refuge, a man named David sat in a sunlit kitchen, sipping black coffee and staring out at the snow-dusted yard. He had lived a long life, filled with years that stretched across countries and losses and triumphs alike. His hands were calloused from decades of woodwork and engine grease. His heart was worn from goodbyes. Retirement hadn't come with the peace he'd expected. It came with quiet days and quieter nights. The echo of footsteps that no longer passed through the halls. The house, once full of laughter and late dinners and the creak of the back door opening to let the dog in, had grown still. The shelves still held family photos, some faded, some newer, but none of them changed anymore. The silence wasn't oppressive, just persistent, like dust gathering in corners you no longer noticed until the sunlight hit just right. David had routines. He woke early, fixed his coffee, watched the news with the sound low. He shoveled the driveway even when it barely needed it. He repaired bird feeders. He fixed old clocks no one had asked him to fix. He kept himself busy, but not fulfilled. It was David's friend, a woman who had known him since they were children, who first mentioned the idea. They had grown up on the same block, lost touch for a while, and reconnected in recent years through shared grief and shared memories. She knew the old David, the one who could talk a hawk down from a fence post, who once coaxed a wounded deer into a shed during a blizzard just to keep it safe until morning. "You always did better with something to take care of," she said one morning as she passed him a thermos of soup. "A dog, a bird, even those damn raccoons you used to feed. Behind the shed, what about something different? The refuge in Bitterroot has bobcats." David raised an eyebrow. "Bobcats? They're not for everyone," she said. "But I think you're not everyone." He didn't make a decision right away. He didn't speak of it for nearly 2 weeks. But one night, as the wind howled outside and the house felt more like a tomb than a home, he found himself calling the number his friend had left scribbled on the back of a grocery list. A calm voice answered, a man named Paul. They talked for a long while, about bobcats, about the refuge, about Soft. David hadn't known what to expect when he made the call. Maybe a short, awkward conversation, maybe some information about adoption requirements, maybe even a quiet rejection. What he didn't expect was Paul's voice to be steady, warm, and disarmingly thoughtful. Paul didn't rush. He didn't try to sell David on anything. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions gently, and shared stories about Soft that caught David off guard. "He likes to sit by the radio," Paul said. "Only when the classical station's on. It's strange. Calms him." David chuckled softly, caught off guard by the detail. "He's got good taste." "We think so," Paul said. Then a pause. "He's particular, not shy, not unfriendly, just selective. We've had dozens of people walk by. He doesn't even look up. But there's something in him that's waiting, like he knows the right person will come." David ran a hand over his chin, staring at the yellowed edge of the grocery list, now creased where his fingers had worried it. "And if that person doesn't?" "He'll still be cared for," Paul said simply. "But I think he's hoping otherwise." David hung up later than expected, the wind still battering the old oak out back. He didn't sleep much that night. Instead, he walked the halls of his house, pausing at old photo frames, running fingers over grooves in furniture he hadn't touched in months. By morning, the snow had started falling again, thick and slow, the kind that muffled the world. He packed a small bag, filled his thermos, grabbed the wool blanket from the foot of the bed just in case. 3 days later, David was behind the wheel of his old truck, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and a wool blanket folded neatly on the passenger seat. The road to Bitterroot was winding, framed by evergreens and soft blue skies. His tires crunched over patches of frozen earth, and the pine needles above trembled with the weight of last night's frost. He hadn't felt this kind of nervousness in years. Not since the last time he held something fragile in his arms and wondered if he could be trusted not to break it. He thought about turning back more than once, not out of fear, but humility. What if Soft didn't take to him? What if the connection Paul spoke of didn't happen? What if the silence in his home wasn't something that could be filled? But with every mile, that doubt faded gently, like breath, fogging a window, then clearing. When he arrived at the refuge, he didn't expect anything. He didn't expect Soft to choose him, but that's exactly what happened. The parking lot was half covered in frost, tire tracks visible from an earlier vehicle. A volunteer greeted him at the front door, offered him coffee, and led him down a quiet hallway toward the main animal holding area. David's boots echoed softly on the tile, the hum of heaters and soft animal noises the only sounds in the building. He wasn't prepared for what came next. As soon as David stepped into the main room, Soft stood up in his enclosure and pressed his paws to the mesh golden eyes locked on the old man. He didn't snarl, didn't retreat. He just stared, and then, without warning, let out a tiny chuff and reached through the wire. David crouched, and their eyes met on level ground. "He's never done that," one of the handlers whispered. "He usually doesn't interact with strangers." David said nothing. He just extended a calloused hand through the gap. Soft sniffed it once, then pushed his head against the palm, rubbing his cheek along David's fingers like he'd known him forever. There was no need for discussion. Not really. The staff saw it. David felt it. Soft had decided. The ride back to David's home was long, but not lonely. 10 minutes into the drive, Soft tore through the cardboard carrier like it was made of paper. The sound startled David. A sharp ripping, a sudden thud, and he instinctively hit the brakes, his heart leaping to his throat. He looked over, half expecting to see a panicked bobcat trying to claw its way to the window or leap into the back seat. But instead, he found Soft standing calmly on the center console, eyes locked onto his with quiet intensity. There was no aggression, no confusion, only a strange kind of certainty. Before David could react, Soft stepped down onto his lap with the confidence of a creature who had made a decision and would not entertain alternatives. He curled up like a house cat half his size, tucking his legs under himself and pressing his cheek into David's chest. His breathing was slow, steady. He gave one long exhale and then remained completely still. He trailed behind him like a shadow, stepping where David stepped, watching every move with calm, unblinking eyes. When David cooked, Soft sat beside the fridge, occasionally tilting his head when the sound of a knife on a cutting board rang out, or the kettle began to hiss. When David napped, Soft curled beside his feet, his tail draped across the tops of David's shoes like an unspoken tether. And when David sat in his chair by the fire, a battered old recliner with the stuffing exposed at the arms, Soft climbed into his lap, no longer a tiny cub, but still impossibly gentle, and pressed his entire body against the man's chest. There was no moment of learning, no awkward adjustment period. It was as if they had always lived in rhythm. Soft mirrored David's expressions, raising a brow when David did, twitching his whiskers when David smiled. When David bent down to tie his boots, Soft waited beside him, eyes on the laces like they were the most fascinating things in the world. When David worked outside repairing the birdhouse or fixing the fence, Soft sat nearby on a boulder or patch of snowless ground, his gaze steady and constant, like a silent foreman watching over the site. It was like they were tuned to the same quiet frequency. David never once raised his voice with him. He didn't have to. Soft understood. A few months later, in early spring, when the snow began to melt and the first robins returned, David's friend came by again, this time carrying a tiny black bundle of fluff in her arms. She didn't come through the front door right away, just stood on the porch holding the creature wrapped in a faded towel. Her voice cracked as she said, "I didn't plan to, but he needed someone, and I thought maybe Soft could help." David opened the screen door and peered down at the bundle. The kitten was no more than a few weeks old, sickly and frightened, with tufts of fur sticking out like brittle weeds, ribs faintly visible beneath the skin. His eyes were too large for his face, and they darted from side to side as if expecting pain at every moment. David looked down at the kitten, then over his shoulder at the bobcat who had come to stand silently behind him. Soft's ears twitched forward, his pupils wide but calm. Without any prompting, Soft walked up slowly, head tilted. He sniffed the little thing once, then, like some ancient instinct had clicked into place, he wrapped a paw around the kitten and pulled him close. resting his head over the tiny body like a shield. David blinked in disbelief. The kitten trembled once, then stopped. David named him Cole, and from that moment, Soft became his protector. There was no jealousy, no territorial posturing, merely a quiet assumption of responsibility. Soft treated Cole like a baby brother, grooming him, guiding him, even nudging him away from hot stoves or open windows. When Cole didn't understand the dangers of cords or heating vents or that terrifying vacuum cleaner, Soft would gently intervene, sometimes using a paw to block his path, other times stepping between him and whatever was causing the anxiety. He played gently, never using his full strength. When Cole pounced with tiny claws and kitten growls, Soft would roll over and let the little one win, swatting back with only the soft pads of his paws. He groomed him thoroughly each night, his tongue slow and precise, flattening Cole's unruly fur with care. And at night, the two curled up beside David's bed, the bobcat's larger body wrapped around the kitten's smaller one like a living blanket. Seasons passed. Snow came and went. The mountains bloomed green again. The rivers unfroze and rushed loud through valleys still echoing with winter's breath. In town, people packed away heavy coats and opened windows for the first time in months. Birds returned to the trees like old friends resuming their posts. And in the little house tucked beneath the pines, Soft grew into a magnificent creature, his coat thick with smoky streaks, his body strong and graceful, but his heart remained the same. He was kind, watchful, gentle in a way that defied every stereotype about his kind. His movements had the elegance of a predator, fluid, calculated, powerful when they needed to be, but there was no malice in them, no restless edge. He moved through the house with the same quiet deliberateness as David, matching the pace of a life lived with meaning instead of speed. He was no longer a cub, but a full-grown bobcat, lean and muscular and impossible to miss. And yet somehow, he always managed to settle into spaces like he belonged there. Curled under the kitchen table, perched softly on the edge of the couch, stretched long beside the hearth where the fire cracked and popped. David would sit on the porch in the evenings. Soft beside him, Cole stretched out between them. The sky would shift from blue to lavender to a gentle cotton-soft pink, and the wind would carry pine and damp soil, and sometimes the faintest scent of wild sage. David never rushed those hours. He'd sip his tea slowly, watching the horizon change color, while one hand rested on the thick fur of the bobcat, who leaned lightly against his leg. Sometimes neighbors passed and did double takes, shocked to see a bobcat lounging like a pet. But Soft wasn't a pet. He was a soul, a presence, a quiet heartbeat that gave David purpose. The mailman had stopped once, wide-eyed and frozen halfway, up the walk. You know there's a bobcat out here, right?" he stammered. David had chuckled. "I do, he's family." Word spread slowly, cautiously. Some people warned him. Others asked questions. But over time, they saw the truth for themselves. Soft wasn't dangerous. He was deliberate, patient. He didn't chase or scratch or growl. He simply existed where he belonged. Once, a neighbor's dog got loose and came barreling into the yard, barking and growling, his fur bristling with territorial panic. Cole, still small and unsure, froze beside a tree stump. David stood halfway down the steps, unsure whether to run forward or call out, but Soft didn't lunge. He didn't hiss. He simply stepped in front of Cole, planted his body like a wall, and stared the dog down with calm, unflinching eyes. His ears flicked once, his shoulders squared, and that stillness, anchored, resolute, was louder than any snarl. The dog skidded to a stop, whimpered once, then turned and retreated, tail tucked between its legs. David laughed for the first time in weeks that night. Not a chuckle or polite smile, but a real belly-deep laugh that startled even himself. Later, he scratched behind Soft's ear and said, "You've got a better sense of peace than half the people I've ever met." Now, 2 years later, the house no longer feels empty. It is filled with the rustle of fur on floorboards, the click of claws on tile, the gentle weight of life that had once been missing. There are bowls near the fridge, climbing perches in the corner of the living room. Scratches on the floor from late-night sprints between Soft and Cole, chasing a toy mouse, or each other, or simply shadows. There are strands of fur on the rugs, and warm patches on the sofa cushions. Soft still follows David from room to room. He still curls beside him during storms, his heavy frame a reassuring presence when thunder growls outside. He still presses his head into the crook of David's neck when the old man sighs too heavily, as if to absorb some of the weight himself. Cole has grown too, sleek and quick, but never far from his brother's side. He mimics Soft's calm, learning through osmosis how to be still in a world that often forgets stillness. The two of them together, wild and domestic, large and small, fierce and gentle, move like a single perfect contradiction. David's friend often visits, and each time she shakes her head with a smile. "I told you you weren't everyone." David just chuckles, scratching Soft behind the ears. Turns out neither is he. They are two souls that met by chance and stayed by choice. A man and a bobcat, both once lost, both now found. And in the warm light of the Montana sun, the porch holds them both side by side, heartbeat to heartbeat.